Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I'm Aparna from IIT Bombay and I'm going to discuss about a module on public space which comes under paper of Sociology of Urban Transformation. So let's see what we are going to learn in this module. This module explains the significance of public spaces in urban life. It represents the issues and challenges which are faced by public spaces in contemporary urban India. And in particular, this module discusses how increasing privatization results in shrinking of public spaces. It also discusses the various contestations and struggles around public space with the case of street vendors in India and the challenges of the use of public space from the perspective of gender. So starting from town halls that were built in ancient cities to the gardens developed by the British to the parks and public gardens and open maidans in contemporary time, public space have always held a significance in public life. Public is a judicial category firmly in the ambit of state and law. So a contrast to that, what is private? So in contemporary cities, the public spaces include parks, plazas, sidewalks, community centers, schoolyards, open and green spaces, and of course many more such spaces. The fundamental tenets of publicness are freedom of access and accessibility of public spaces to all groups of the population. Together, these characteristics render public space a generic destination for a variety of places that host regular, voluntary, informal, and happy anticipated gatherings of individuals beyond the realms of home and work. An alternative point of entry into the idea of public in urban setting comes from the concept of urban commons. These include public goods, the air we breathe, public parks and spaces, public transportation, public sanitation system, public schools, public waterways, and also the less obvious municipal garbage that provides livelihoods to waste pickers. And also wetlands, water bodies, and riverbeds that sustain fishing communities and washerwomen. So streets as arteries of movement, but also as places where people work, live, love, dream, and voice dissent. Public space also connotes local bazaars that are sites of commerce and cultural invention. So it is evident the idea of urban common differs from, in significant ways from the idea of public space in encompassing resources beyond the spatial. So moreover, unlike public, which lie firmly within the ambit of the state and law, the commons lie at the frontiers of territorial grid of the law. Moreover, commons need communities to safeguard them. In the absence of such communities, they are vulnerable to privatization. Nonetheless, these concepts are closely allied, even if they emphasize different features of civic life in the city. In fact, public spaces and urban commons have carried varied meanings across cultures and across time. The feature of open access and accommodation of difference, what Caldeira calls the modern and democratic public space, as an ideal of the open city. The work of Caldeira in Sao Paulo, Brazil, as well as authors such as Kaviraj in India, demonstrates that this modern ideal of public space is not constant. It is not constant either across cultures or over time. Instead, the publicness of a space can become subject to competing claims, encroachments, and enclosure by both elite and subaltern groups. Indeed, one can also think of spaces that are seemingly public but are also actually private. Examples include shopping malls, spas and beauty parlors, clubs, cafes, gymnasium, amusement parks. They are accessible to everyone, provided one is able to pay for them. So such spaces lie in the grey zone between public and private, but they're also increasingly subject to privatization. Significance of public space. Historically, public spaces have evolved alongside changing sites. Madari Power cites the examples of agora in Greek cities, the forum in Roman cities, and market squares in medieval cities. In contemporary India, the Ghats in Ujjain have been highlighted as a similar urban public realm. Yet, As the discussion of public spaces and urban commons showed, the notions of public varied across cultures and civilizations. The next section highlights what Caldera has called the modern democratic ideal of urban public space and its relationship to democratic politics. So, what is the modern ideal of public space? According to Caldera, openness, accommodation of difference, and equality are some of the hallmarks of modern and democratic urban public space. Madani Power takes a more functional angle to argue that such spaces should be accessible places developed through inclusive processes. A key outcome of these features is that allows different social groups to come into contact in public space even when residential patterns remain segregated. In broad terms, space can be differentiated as public and private based on the criteria of accessibility. In other words, public spaces are inclusive because they are accessible to the general public. For instance, public transport, public gardens and parks, streets, walkways, sidewalks, footpaths are public spaces. In contrast, private spaces are exclusive as their accessibility is limited by factors like ownership, use, and ability to pay. For instance, private residences, resorts, and hotels. And there is a range of gray spaces between these categories, including places such as malls, private parks, or recreational facilities, etc., that may be considered partially private. What value, if any, attaches to modern public space in cities around the world? On one hand is a perspective offered by Amin in 2006, who argues that the collective promise of urban public space comes from the sociability and civic sensibility it allows, even when these spaces emphasize consumption and leisure practices, rather than political engagement per se. Through and beyond the consumption and leisure practices, the experience of public space remains one of sociability and social recognition and general acceptance of the goods of civic conducts and the benefits of access to collective public resources. It continues to be an experience that supports building awareness of the commons, perhaps one that falls short of fostering active involvement in the life of a city, but still underpins cultures of sociability and civic sensibility. Amin's argument thus downplays the strictly political value of public space. In fact, the ideas of citizenship, associational life, civic traditions have an important bearing on the development of public space. It is, therefore, worthwhile to understand the political significance of public space, especially in democracies such as India. The next subsection analyzes the political significance of public space. So, what is political significance of public space? What pictures comes to our mind when we talk about public parks like Jantar Mantar in New Delhi, Shivaji Park in Mumbai, Taksim Square in Istanbul, Tiananmen Square in Beijing, China, and Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar? Political significance of public space. What picture comes to our mind when we think of public parks like Jantar Mantar in New Delhi, Shivaji Park in Mumbai, Taksim Square in Istanbul, Tiananmen Square in Beijing, China, and Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar? Each of these places has served as sites of protest at particular points in history. The Jantar Mantar made news throughout year 2011 because this was the site where the anti-corruption movement unfolded. Shivaji Bagh in Mumbai has a long history of holding gatherings and meetings, especially those led by the Shiva Sena. In Istanbul, citizens protested plans to build a mall complex that would destroy Gezi Park in Taksim Square. These protests were in news in major part of 2013. Tiananmen Square, long and empty space, was transformed into a political public space with student protest in 1989. Public places such as the Jantar Mantar, Shivaji Park, and Taksim offer opportunities for citizens to engage with politics and, if necessary, protest against government actions. In an interesting study on the role of a public place in social movements, Seed argues that a public space that already has a history of protest and is labeled as politicized space can itself serve to draw people and encourage them to participate in a movement. His argument is based on his examination of the understanding of Tahrir Square and its role played in the Egyptian Revolution of 2011. Authors have often argued that public spaces are vital for democratic expression besides their recreational value. They cite the example of Mumbai, which was once famous for its working class militancy, demonstrations, and highly disciplined marches and strikes. But these are increasingly being curbed by government repression coupled with vanishing public spaces. The demonstrators are now confined to Azad Maidan, a colonial era ground, and their isolation is enhanced by a humiliating barbed wire fence. The modern ideal of public space may not be the only model of public space, but it provides a powerful link to political expression. The discussion suggests that any attempt to limit the use of public spaces or privatize public spaces can affect space for citizens' dissent in the long run. Thus, the meaningful challenges of conversation of public spaces can be said to be connected to larger questions of protections or of citizens' rights, crucial for a functioning democracy like India. Although the modern ideal of public space exercises a powerful imaginative hold, it is important to keep in mind that it is not the only model of a public space. Vernacular Indian concepts of public space differed substantially from this modern ideal. Let's talk about public and public spaces in India. Drawing on evidence from Calcutta, Sudipta Kaviraj has argued that in pre-colonial Indian cities, public spaces were uncared for outside spaces from which propertied citizens and state actors remained disengaged. The street was the outside, the space for which one did not have responsibility or which was not one's own, and it therefore lacked any association with obligation because it did not symbolize any significant principle, did not express any values. This, in a view, very different from civic space, which has its own norms and rules of use of its own, different from the domestic values of bourgeoisie's privacy. Thus, such spaces remained unregulated and subject to negotiated use, not unlike to the commons. This is key to understanding the claims and counterclaims on the street in the Indian context, which are examined in the following sections. Equally, ceremony and celebration remain significant uses of public space in the Indian context. South Asian collective activities in open spaces constituted a fundamental form of expression of the polity. Yet, colonial policies have led to contestation over both these senses of public spaces in the Indian city. Citing Fateh Vanka notes that the colonists sought to depoliticize public spaces by categorizing public celebrations of religious occasions as private events. Furthermore, while the pre-colonial notion of public as not private or valueless rendered such spaces open to a multiplicity of claims which colonial policies increasingly regulated and restricted both for users and users. For example, We might have heard from elders that certain spaces such as theaters and public grounds were restricted for general public. Similarly, the Mall Road in Missouri had restrictions for Indian public. Though it has different rhetoric, but such regulation has continued to intensify in post-colonial India on grounds of aesthetic and safety by middle-class claimants. At the same time, older conceptions of public space have allowed the poor to make claims on it. Kaviraj captures the plebeianization of public space by distinguishing public from the vernacular public space, that is, not owned by individual property owners. That became subject to livelihood and squatting claims by the poor. Institutions like the government or municipal authorities have been more hospitable or less hostile to such claims on public space, though that is not always the case, as a number of highly publicized eviction drives in recent years have shown. These various conceptions of public space come face to face in the struggles of street vendors discussed in the following section. Privatization and shrinking of public spaces in India. The boundaries of public and private are not fixed, but get redefined and restructured over time. This restructuring of spaces is informed by a number of sociological, economic, and political factors. For instance, Madani Power contends that with the ascendance of free market political paradigms in the West, public and private organizations and their associated professionals had lost interest in the public space, seeing it as irrelevant or expensive, or were encroaching upon it for private gains. Thus, privatized public spaces are an increasingly prominent feature of cities across the world. One mechanism for such privatization is the mushrooming of gated communities across cities in the global south, including India. The neoliberal city of gated communities and neighborhood enclosures, golf courses, newly laid residential enclaves, toll roads, flyovers, and bridges for the easy flow of traffic that are mostly private vehicles are also witness to the increasing privatization of urban spaces. Various studies have shown how development of gated communities imposes limitations on public access and accessibility of streets, walkways, and such other public spaces. Caldera calls this a process of implosion of public space. As the rich retreat into their gated communities, public spaces lose social diversity. Encounters across social class barriers become less and less likely. In Sao Paulo, which Caldeira calls a city of walls, processes of gating have been caused and reinforced by widespread fear of crime, which has physically transformed public spaces by the presence of high barriers, armed security guards, and restricted access to streets. Similarly, in democratic South Africa, contemporary urban settlement planning epitomizes the gated community phenomenon, which includes security villages and enclosed neighborhoods. Ramaroka and Shola explain that in South Africa, increasing number of gated community create physical enclosures that transfer public spaces to private control and ownership, thereby perpetuating apartheid social exclusion legacies within South Africa's towns and cities. In what ways does such privatization matter? As Calderia points out, once walls are built, they alter public life. Based on the Sao Paulo experience, her work also shows that the implosion of urban public spaces can occur alongside avenues for increasing democratic participation. Indeed, she suggests that the segregation and intolerance built into public spaces by processes of gating often represent a reaction of democratization across other spheres. The phenomena of privatization of space has played out a little differently across cities of India. As Kaviraj has highlighted, public space carries a different set of meanings in the Indian context. Even so, Date points out the phenomena of privatization of a space has played out a little differently across cities of India. As Kaviraj has highlighted, public space carries a different set of meanings in the Indian context. Even so, Date points out that of the few open green spaces in the city of Mumbai, several are controlled by private luxury clubs and other institutions. Several municipal parks are also being privatized with entry free and are unaffordable for the poor. Public parks like the Almeida Park in Bandra, which are still fully accessible to the people, are turning into rarities. So are eating houses such as the historic Irani restaurants that are being converted into other uses. While walking spaces for common people are neglected, there is a substantial increase in recreational walking spaces, either for jogging and running, created by affluent residents with corporate or government support limited to upper class areas. Elite civil society organizations expound exclusionary ideas about zoning to eliminate street vendors and slum communities that encroach upon middle class urban spaces. Some of the recommendations of middle class reflect their elitist stand. For instance, its recommendations on the scheme for hawkers in Mumbai. A group of civil society organizations maintain that footpaths and roads were just for commuting. The use of public streets and pavements is, first, meant for the use of general public. They are not laid to facilitate the carrying on of private businesses. Singh points out that the municipal authorities' guidelines for the maintenance of open spaces reserved for recreation grounds and playgrounds allow trusts and citizen groups to manage such plots either on an adoption or a caretaker basis. Resident welfare associations that have adopted public gardens from the municipal authority for maintenance invariably bar neighborhood slum residents from entry into the space on the pretext of maintaining cleanliness. In contemporary urban India, the urban commons are also being rapidly diminishing and replaced by new privatized and monitored public spaces such as malls, plazas, and gated venues. It is evident that privatization of public space in India in particular have differential impacts on different classes and groups of people, and it serves to undercut the poor's right to the city. Against the backdrop of Kaviraj's analysis of the claims on public space by poorer groups, these processes also recall the politics of forgetting and spatial purification invoked by Fernandez, which serves to remove the poor from the city. The hawker minac targeted by middle class associations are seen as a threat to a wide array of bourgeoisie's interests, including inconvenience, sanitation, fears of social disorder, and the threat of declining real estate prices for residential areas market for relocating hawkers. Safety and contestations around public space. Increasing privatization results in shrinking of public spaces. However, contestation and conflict over the limited public spaces that remain available in Indian cities also results from negotiations over the meaning of public. In developing countries, cities contestations over public spaces emerge over roads, sidewalks, and parks. The struggle of street vendors is a useful case to understand such conflict. In a classic work, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, Jean Jacobs critiques the current principles that have shaped modern city planning in the West. Her critique also applies in developing countries like India. She argues that planners are concerned about how cities must look, and not how cities work. In realities, cities function quite differently. More often than not, cities develop organically. Most cities carry the imprint of mixed land use. Formal spaces exist within formal spaces of work, living, and leisure side by side. Jane Jacobs propagated the ideas of dense cities and diversity, as opposed to segregated planned cities. She coined the phrase eyes on the street to talk about the significance of mixed land use and diversity in the cities. Diversity and mixed land use, as opposed to spatial segregation, are important not only for the social life but also to maintain public order and safety. Spaces solely dedicated to office use, like the Ballard State, Nariman Point, Bandra Kurla complex in Mumbai, became rather unsafe at night. Drawing from the experience of successful and safe neighborhoods, many of them quite poor, in Boston, New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, she explained that the successful urban neighborhood required an animated street scene of foot traffic throughout the day. That in turn was underwritten by a great diversity in housing, commerce, and occupations. In his study on street vendor in New York, Michel explains that although a public nuisance in the eyes of city authorities, street vendors in fact produce safe public spaces and enhance the quality of life in the neighborhoods. Indeed, in Indian cities, street vendors and hawkers similarly help maintain safety on the roads and public order. Sadhana uses Jacob's idea in her analysis of the Delhi metro stations as public spaces and critiques the rising use of CCTV in place of eyes on the street. So let's understand the concept of public space through analysis of a case of street vendors in India. In world-class city imagination that drives contemporary urban development to a great extent, street vendors are categorized as nuisance, and therefore they must be removed from city spaces like sidewalks, footpaths around railway stations, and parks. The removal of city vendors is closely linked to the logic of efficiency in urban governance, urban beautification, and new aspirations about city. Prioritizing efficiency in urban governance is tied to the new aspiration about the usage of city space, which is then connected to the cultural practices of consumption and lifestyle changes of Mumbai middle classes. The new aesthetics of the city architectures, they stress beautification and the need to do away with all that ugly things, including encroachments in the form of street vendors. Taking various judicial cases, one can note how the claims made by street vendors echo the negotiations over public spaces in India that were described by Kaviraj. Nonetheless, a lot depends on the judiciary and how it reads and interprets citizens' right, especially when they conflict with one another. Scholars have theorized on rights and the use of public space in different ways, especially with reference to street vending. For example, Nath explains that the right to existential space is the physical space required by a person to follow economic activities in order to survive. An existential space of affluent citizen is bigger and encroaches on the existential space of the poor. The poor bereft of existential space that is not affordable for them encroach on public, then they encroach on public space for their survival needs. T-Line Tello elaborates that the right to existential space in practical application defies another essential concept, namely that of natural markets. The right to existential space implements through space allocation, choosing a space that offers least competition with other functions or activities. Therefore, it avoids conflict of interest. Yet, natural markets are usually in places with multiple functions and external competitions, so a conflict of interest is inevitable. Gender and public space. The public versus private also has a gender dimension. Inner spaces in residential structures, referred to as antamahal, are private, usually occupied by women. In contrast, the spaces on the outside, like the living room and courtyard, connecting the residential structure with the outside world, are more public, open to outsiders, and usually occupied by men. Antamahal or ladies' quarters that we find in residential units since the pre-colonial time have been beautifully depicted in films like Ghare Baire by Satyajit Ray. This film is particularly interesting as the Lady of Houses creates a revolution when she first steps out of the private women quarters to the living room labeled as public. That created a stir, as women's mobility during those times was strictly limited to the private quarters. To understand the linkages between public space and gender, one must refer to some scholarly works done in this area. Shilpa Phadke et al. In their book Violator offer a broader understanding of the linkages between gender and spaces in cities by explaining that loiter, which means standing at street corners, doing time pass over chai without surveillance, using clean toilets after dark, and indulging in consensual flirtation and sexual encounters. They actually has the potential to change the terms of negotiation in city public spaces and creating the possibility of a radically altered city, not just for women, for everyone. They argue that the political project of making public spaces habitable for women is not enough. Women should have the right to loiter, have fun, and seek pleasure without being at risk. Why should boys have all the fun? Is a statement that indicates towards the Phadke et al. Argument. Therefore, they shift the debate from the politics of safety to the politics of pleasure by adding another dimension in the gender and public space debate. Urban design, city planning, and infrastructure, especially public places like public toilets and public transport, tend to restrict women's access to public spaces. Take the case of public toilets. Women's access to public toilets in cities is abysmally low. Even when limited access is available, they are unclean and pose serious threat on women's health. Public toilets also pose security and safety challenges and also carry the threat of sexual violence. Limited or no access to public toilets by unprivileged women forces them to use railway tracks behind bushes, behind parked cars, open spaces, urban jungles near nalas, showing the ways in which public spaces are transformed in Indian cities. So let's summarize what we have learned in this module. This module has introduced the concept of public spaces and the many meaning it carries in different cultures and scholarly interpretations. It has also discussed the significance of public space in urban life and its potential significance. The various challenges around public places in contemporary urban contexts were discussed in this module, with special reference to the rise of privatized gated communities and other privatized public spaces like shopping malls that result in the shrinking of public spaces. Increased privatization in turn is related to new modes of city planning, which is driven by private capital and aspiration of world-class cities. So this mode of city development invariably leads to greater struggles and more contestations among citizens. This contestation, especially in relation to public spaces, is brought out with the case of street vendors in India. The importance of dense cities and diversity are brought out, especially with reference to the presence of street vendors in cities in the discussions on the importance of public space, public order, and safety in cities. The judiciary, academic, civil society groups, and street vendors associations have interpreted the issues of citizens' rights in varied ways according to their need. And the ensuing discourse has further complicated the questions related to the use of public space, rights, and attendant contestations. So, the discussion on gender in relation to public space also becomes significant because it brings out challenges that women face in the access and use of public space on an everyday basis.